Okay, at this time I'd like to invite comments from, if you could introduce yourself too, please.
Yes, hi, my name is Susanna McNeil. Before I ask my question about the compassion in society and how we can create a balance between that and government, I'd just like to point out that government, if you actually examine who makes up government, look at our Congress and see the, no insult intended, the percentage of lawyers and the lack of people in any actual profession that make up government. And these are the deciders. But I would say that if we as a society, and I bring this to both of your attention, decide that, for example, we want to ensure that the elderly have a security cushion in their old age, why is it a necessary conclusion that it should be a one-size-fits-all government approach to that problem? Why could it not be just as valuable or just as appropriate to say, we will support every senior on a means-tested basis with X amount of money that will be set aside throughout their lives and then available to them to invest or do with as they wish. In other words, private accounts to accomplish the same goal. I know I have both Social Security and private investments. There's zero comparison between the rate of growth in those two. Sorry.
I mean, I'll start us off. I dismiss the whole premise of the question. We as a society don't decide stuff like that. I mean, it's wrong for a group within society to decide what to do for another group within society. You know, that whole way of thinking is a problem, and this is why I don't think Republicans get anything done when they get in, because they've granted the moral high ground to the left. They've granted the collectivist premise that it's okay for a group of Americans, 51%, 52%, which David agrees shouldn't be allowed to, for example, ban abortion. I'm just saying, I agree with that. They shouldn't be allowed to ban abortion. But then they shouldn't be allowed to take my money, and they shouldn't be allowed to tell me what to do or what not to do with retirement, and who to help and who not to help. So I don't believe in private accounts. I don't believe in non-private accounts. I just believe that the government has no role to play here. That is, if you want to save for retirement, go for it. If you don't want to save for retirement, I hope you have a lot of wealthy kids who are willing to feed you and clothe you when you're old. And this goes to David's point about the elderly are more free. You know, maybe. I mean even really, yes, they have, maybe they have less risk, and, you know, because their health care is taken care of, and they have less risk because they get Social Security. I'd say two things to that. One is some of the elderly. So there are two groups of elderly in my view: responsible and irresponsible. The responsible ones would have been those people who, over the years, would have taken a portion of their salary and put it away and saved if there was no Social Security. And those people are worse off under Social Security because Social Security doesn't give the return that a private investment would have. And then there's the irresponsible ones. The irresponsible ones are like many young people that you know. Every dollar that they earn, they consume. So they don't save at all. They make off like bandits under Social Security because they would have never saved. They would have been poor in old age, and now they're doing great. But who suffered at the expense of the responsible ones? So this is the morality of the system. We penalize responsibility and reward irresponsibility. The other aspect of this is, again, let's assume that they are somehow better off under Social Security and Medicare. At whose expense? Well, we know at whose expense. At my kids' expense, at your kids' expense, at your grandkids' expense. They're the ones paying for it. So I would argue, and again, we could go through the whole economic argument, that one of the reasons is that's entrepreneurship. It's because there's less capital, because that capital is being redistributed to the elderly instead of young people being able to hold on to more of it, start a new business. Now they're going to be forced to buy health insurance. Some young people are making the choice of not buying health insurance, but maybe investing in a business. We are basically involved in a massive allocation of wealth, and will be over the next 20 to 30 years, from young people to old people. Now that economically is disastrous and morally reprehensible. Absolutely reprehensible. Now, if I want to take care of my parents and grandparents, that goes back to compassion. I can make that choice as an individual to help individuals. But if I don't like my parents or my grandparents and I don't want to help them, bad luck for them. And I'm okay with that. And so should they. You should have saved.
David, you want to offer a quick?
Yeah, well, this is where compassion comes in, because actually we're not going to let the elderly die on the streets as homeless people. We're going to step in to do something about that, and in fact we have, and I think in a very very effective way. I mean, the Social Security system, I think that we have has been remarkably effective. In fact, if you don't make much money and you don't pay much in, your benefits are very low. And if you make good money and you pay a lot in, your benefits are much higher. And yeah, you don't get the rate of return you would from a private account. But one of the things that Social Security also provides is disability insurance and survivor's insurance. I'm sure people are familiar with that. So if something bad happens, Social Security pays. And also, Social Security is an annuity. Is like an annuity, and anybody who's ever bought an annuity knows that it's very expensive to buy an annuity. If you save a lot of money in a 401k and then go and try to buy an annuity that would do what Social Security does, it's very expensive. So that needs to be taken into this so-called rate of return issue. One final point about Yaron's idea that that it'd be better without Social Security because people would save and we'd have more investment and the economy would do better. Actually, in societies without retirement, social insurance retirement systems, people do save because they're worried they're going to be indigent when they're old. So instead of going out and buying stuff and being consumers and helping spur economic growth, they hoard all their money, which is what you find in a lot of developing countries. And in a place like China, there's not a lot of consumer demand because people are holding on to all their money because they're scared they're going to be impoverished in old age. And I think that one of the reasons that the United States has seen a lot of growth over the past 60 years is because of that social insurance system that gives people a safety net in the old age and lets them spend and be consumers in the prime of their life.
This question from Mr. Callahan. I'm wanting to discern if there are any limiting principles to which you would ascribe when it comes to government. You described the last 60 years of success in America, and you kind of attribute that to government, or at least the role that government's played. Taken to the extreme, it's like saying that the Soviet gulags were responsible for producing great literature, because without them, Solzhenitsyn would have never written Gulag Archipelago. And then you talk about, you use kind of this gooey language that always comes from the left that is nondescript, balance and feeling and consensus building. Specifically, define those words or define limiting principles that you believe should limit government encroachment into our lives more generally. Thank you.
Sure. Well, I'll give you one example, which is that in the United States, we have a federalist system, right? So there's some things that the federal government does, and there's some things that states and localities do, and there's not the sense that the federal government should do everything, and there is a sense that, and sorry to use that word, but there's long been consensus on this, that there is a sort of natural division of labor, that localities do education and infrastructure well, and there's a lot of things that states do well. A lot of social insurance systems, safety net programs. There's a big role in the states, so it's not one size fits all. There's a lot of room for innovation. So one limiting principle is that we have this sort of this federal system with a balance between the centralized government and states and localities doing things. In terms of articulating other limiting principles, I think that's not in a way even necessary because we as a country have done it together. I mean, if you just look at government spending as a percentage of GDP over the last 40 years, it's basically ranged between 18 and 24% or something, and usually more around 19, 20%. And Republican presidents, Democratic presidents, the size of government has not exponentially expanded or dramatically shrunk over the past 50 years because most Americans have felt that this is sort of pretty right. Actually, government spending reached its apex during the Reagan years. People have felt this is right, that there's not been a sense that we want to become Sweden, where they spend more like 50% of GDP. And so, I mean, again, I think that the system has largely been working, and that we as a democratic society have figured out the balance that works for us.
If we could take maybe 3 comments at one time, and then and let, because we are starting to kind of run down on time, and I'd like everybody to have a chance to have their voice heard.
Yes, I'll try and make this brief. This is a question or comment for Yaron. You talk about the use of force and the free market and how this applies to education, healthcare. This really applies to everything. Why don't your principles apply to an organization like the SEC in catching a criminal? And why can't the use of force apply to police protection services and catching a criminal? Because the SEC cannot exist unless they steal our money. So basically, they have to steal our money to prevent other people from stealing our money?
I get it. It's the anarchy question.
Okay.
Okay, I'm going to condense this down real quick. David, you just talked about a limiting principle is a consensus. And then you talked about, well, there's states and there's federal. But all of these are elements of government. And whether it's a monarchy or communism, the power goes to the majority plus one, or the power goes to the king or whomever. Could you tell us, going beyond human will, is there a point where you would say that there is a point, these are all expressions of human will. So is there anything above the will? In other words, whether it's the king is there something the king can't do? Is there something even democracy can't do? Is there an area carved out where government absolutely cannot step in your mind?
Yeah, well, I think that.
Yeah, why don't we take both of those real quick?
Yeah, I think we've had a 220-year debate about that, and a lot of that debate has been centered around the Bill of Rights, and you know the founders certainly had an idea that there were certain inviolate rights that we as individuals had, and I think that was a key idea of the Enlightenment that shaped our. Well, they didn't see it as created by the government. They saw it as sort of and I'm sure Yaron will want to chime in on this as well. They saw it as rights that we inherently have as human beings, and that government could not infringe upon, but nor could other kinds of entities. And I think that that we've had a debate ever since. Well, what is the boundaries of those rights, and what can government tell us that we can and cannot do? And can government, abortion is a good example, that there's significant debate over whether there's a right to privacy. Very, very controversial issue. Can government tell us that we can't have an abortion?
What do you say is the line government can't cross?
Well, in what area? There's a lot of different areas, and I think. I think that I think this is something that we need to work out as a society. I have my own preferences. Yaron has some of his preferences. I don't think that. I personally don't think that government should stop somebody from having an abortion. I don't think that government should stop two people of different races from marrying each other. I don't think that government should be able to search our houses without a warrant. I don't think that government should be able to lock us up without a trial. I don't think that. I could go on. There's all sorts of things I don't think government should be allowed to do, and most of those things are reflected in the Bill of Rights. I don't think government should stop two people of the same sex from having sex.
So my view, all those things that David doesn't think government should do, I agree with, and the problem is that there's no unifying principle there, and it comes, I think, from a lack of defining what individual rights mean and understanding what they were there for. And remember, these are inalienable individual rights, right? If you understand what individual rights means, it's not sometimes, it's not 50%, 30%. It's the whole shebang, and it's always. That's what inalienable means. You have them, nobody is allowed to take them away. Now, 51%, not 99%. And if you have a right to life, then that means you have a right to your life, to do with your life as you please, as long as you're not interfering with somebody else's life. And what is the Enlightenment understanding of interfering with somebody else's life is? It's forcibly entering their property. It's forcibly, punching them in the face. It's defrauding them. That's what interfering means. Other than that, individual rights mean that you have freedom to pursue your life, to do with your life as you choose. To pursue, we talked about values, to pursue your values, not somebody else's values, not the values of society, not the values of the church, not the values of a majority, but your values. And that's what freedom means. Freedom means the elimination of coercion. You're not free when you're being coerced. So yes, in certain areas we're freer today than we were 50 years ago in a lot of the social areas, but ask any businessman, we're far less free today than we were 50 years ago when it comes to big aspects of our lives. And let me ask the related question about anarchy. It's somewhat related to the issue of individual rights. So there are a number of ways to approach this, but in my view, force is the anti-life. Force, violence, coercion is anti-life, and what that means is it's anti-reason, it's anti the human mind, it's anti-markets, it's anti-capitalism, it's anti-everything. You can't have a market in it. You can't trade in it. There's no win-wins when it comes to force. Force is the anti-win-win. It's the essence of zero sum, negative sum. I punch you in the face. Nobody is better off if you really understand what better off means from a values perspective. So you can't have a market in force. I can't have my police and your police. And what are they going to negotiate? The only negotiation is who has the bigger gun at the end of the day. There is no way to arbitrate that other than through violence. So anarchy leads to totalitarianism. Anarchy is a form of totalitarianism. It leads necessarily to that. There's no way practically to resolve those problems, and it can't be metaphysically because of the nature of force, the nature of violence. It's anti-ethical to freedom. It's anti-ethical to reason. And that's the most important point. You can't trade in something that's anti-ethical to reason. So it's both impractical. It really falls apart very quickly. And more importantly, it's just a violation of the principle of life. So you need an entity that monopolizes the use of force, that extracts force from society, that only uses force in retaliation, only uses force to protect us from force, to eliminate force. That's the only purpose, and that's the purpose of government. Whether it's a good government or a bad government, all governments, what characterizes them is they have a monopoly over the use of force, and that's a good thing. That's not a bad thing. A good government only uses force in retaliation. It doesn't initiate the use of force. So anarchy falls apart both practically and ethically. It's just a wrong, immoral system.
Okay, if we could take 3 questions.
David, in your opening remarks, you talked about the extraordinary run that the West has been on Europe, the United States, for the last 65 years, with this combination of big government growing even larger and our private marketplace. But I thought it was interesting that you didn't even make a passing comment about the extraordinary difference between what we take in on a monthly basis and an annual basis versus what we spend, which we're funding we spend $330 billion a month. We only take in $210 billion a month, $120 billion a month in debt, and that number is growing every month. Europe's credit card is being taken away and will be taken away within the next 3 to 5 years. Ours will also. What do we do then?
Well, let me.
Can we get a couple?
So.
Or if there are any more.
Part of my question is
Okay.
I feel as though you're talking about the last 40, 50 years, and I was alive then. You weren't for all of them, but it just keeps growing and escalating. At a certain point, the balance has just gotten very, very skewed, and that's what happens with government. If you've studied ancient histories, you'll see government keeps growing, and it just becomes a monster. So I think we're on the same page here.
Do we have any other comments that are on this theme? Here,
Mine's a little bit on healthcare.
Okay, why don't we just respond to that since we have 2 there that are very similar.
Well, just to take the last point, the government just keeps growing and growing. Actually, that's historically not true. The government is, government has, as a percentage of GDP, been pretty stable for the past 30 years. It's gone up in the last couple of years just because of the recession, the decline of the private economy, and the need, for a lot of spending on stimulus and social insurance programs. But for the most part, government has not just grown and grown and grown. Government got up to a certain size, by the 60s, has remained, give and take a few percentage points of GDP, more or less the same size. And in terms of the deficit, we should have never. The Bush tax cuts were unnecessary and fiscally disastrous. I mean, we everybody will recall had a surplus in 2000. We had a surplus not only because we had a very strong period of economic growth, but because President Clinton had raised taxes in 1993 before that long period of prosperity, which I think is interesting that Clinton raised taxes and then presided over a period of extended prosperity, and we had a surplus. Bush came in, enacted those huge tax cuts, and they did nothing to stimulate the economy. We lost our surplus. We went to deficit, and the way to get out of that, in large part, is to let those Bush tax cuts expire at the end of 2012. There was an interesting analysis that came out recently, which said that the best way for Congress to solve the deficit problem would be to do nothing. If Congress does nothing, that our deficit issue will become not entirely solved, but will become a much smaller problem because those Bush tax cuts will lapse by law, and the government will start to get a lot more revenue. Taxes as a percentage of GDP are at the lowest level they've been since 1950, even as we approach the retirement of the baby boomers. Yes, looking ahead, there's some real fiscal issues, particularly around controlling healthcare costs. Most of the explosion of deficits, if you look in the out decades, is because of unrestrained healthcare costs. If we can control healthcare costs, and there's a lot of good ideas for how to do that, and there's a lot of those ideas are in Obamacare, then we can get a handle on those long-term fiscal challenges. The United States remains a very, very wealthy country, and I think that we can get a handle on these fiscal issues.
Can I respond?
Oh, okay. I was. If we could make it brief.
Just. It's hard to be brief. The economic analysis, in my view, is science fiction on so many fronts. The empirical evidence is quite clear. When we lower taxes, revenue actually increases. And yes, when Clinton raised taxes, the huge benefit was capital gains taxes because of the dot-com boom, which drove those surpluses. And as soon as the dot-coms collapsed, the surpluses vanished. Well before Bush cut taxes, those surpluses vanished because there were no capital gains. We saw exactly the same phenomenon in California. California went through the roof because they have a capital gains tax during the late 1990s. As soon as that went away, they didn't raise taxes. They didn't lower taxes, and yet they lost all that revenue because capital gains were gone. During Reagan, when he cut taxes, revenue go up. Yes, spending goes up faster. That's why there were huge deficits. But revenue goes up. But I'm against taxes. I don't want to defend any particular tax rate. But higher taxes create huge economic distortions and huge economic costs. Lower taxes create entrepreneurial spirit. Look, you can't solve these deficits. Do not go away. By 2025, Medicare, Medicaid, and Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and interest on the debt consume every dollar of revenue under the assumption that the Bush tax cuts go away. Those four programs consume every dollar of revenue. There's nothing left for anything else. These are structural problems, primarily Medicare and Medicaid, Medicaid even bigger than Medicaid. These are real structural problems. The only way to resolve them, and this goes to healthcare, under a government system is through massive rationing, particularly given the numbers that we have in this country. There's no way to solve these, in a way that the American people are going to like. But this is the problem, is that we've grown government so much that unwinding it is so difficult. And so many people are going to get hurt by unwinding it, and they are. It's going to be very, very challenging, that it's almost impossible to do. And it's true, the Republicans are not proposing anything better in terms of really unwinding this, because it is so difficult, because we've become so addicted to this, and it's happened over such a long period of time. And the one disadvantage that I don't have, David can point to the United States over the last 60 years and look how much we've grown. I can't point to the United States under laissez-faire capitalism and tell you, look, our standard of living is 3 times greater or 10 times greater or whatever it is, which I believe strongly that if we hadn't grown government, our standard of living would be astronomically higher than it is today. Government suppresses that standard of living and doesn't increase it.
Okay, we had just a few minutes left, so we can.
Okay. My question is directed at David. You characterized American healthcare spending as a net spend, a loss. But when I think about it, when insurance companies make a profit and hospitals make a profit and doctors make a profit, isn't that proof that they've replaced that economic value with new value they created plus an additional amount which represents the profit? Or am I wrong? Please explain.
I want all of these questions, because this is the last.
Okay. So, please.
I'm not on healthcare, so why don't you answer that? 'Cause
Well, if we could just shield
right,
up,
that's
shield
fine.
all of them.
Over the last 60 years, my lifetime basically, it's been one of great angst for me because I intrinsically felt that liberty was what was most important. But the left has been very successful. And I think they've been successful because they've been allowed to frame the debate. And, this isn't exactly on the topic, but both of our debaters here have made, references to the axioms behind their arguments. And the left continually appeals to compassion as a rejection of greed. And just this year, I read a book by a fellow named Shoak called Envy. And after all these years of angst trying to understand why the left was winning, he made it clear to me. And he made it clear that we've allowed the framework to be completely confused. What's intrinsic in human beings is not compassion, but is envy and the fear of envy. And the left's success has been an appeal to envy and to the fear of envy. And Shoak makes the case that human success and human progress has only been evidenced when the society has eschewed envy and allowed those people within its society that had the ability to progress to not fear the results of envy. And I'd like both our panelists and you as well, if you're familiar with the book, to address themselves to this issue, that the only reason we have been innovative and successful, and those societies and those countries that have been most successful, have been those societies where those of us who have had superior talents didn't have to look over our shoulder for fear of envy from those who were lesser.
Please, we're going to field the rest of the comments.
Okay, well, quick question. There's a ton of people who've been actually chatting about this debate online from literally all over the country, and I wanted to field a question on one of their behalf from Texas. Alan asked, I thought was a really interesting question, specifically to David. There's a question of compassion. Why is it that you would think, he asked, people have to be forced by the government to take care of each other? Do you have a negative view of humanity, was his question. And I remember reading Ayn Rand talked about a benevolent universe. So maybe if I could quickly spread it to both debaters and ask what their perspective is of humanity, of the universe. Is it a malevolent perspective or a benevolent perspective? Thank you.
This wasn't quite the basic discussion of the role of government that I was expecting, although it is nice to hear some references to empathy and compassion within that discussion. And I think if maybe libertarians are a little more empathetic and compassionate, maybe we'd be getting a little further. But what I did not hear, we've heard some comparisons of private and public efficiency. I hadn't heard anything about the deliberate waste by government. Aristotle's Politics has a paragraph on pyramid building. He says it befits a tyrant to deliberately impoverish his people. And then Orwell's Keynes wrote that wars, earthquakes, and pyramid building served to increase wealth. And I heard a little bit of that tonight, a little bit of spend ourselves rich. And then Orwell's 1984, A War is Peace, discusses, I think, what's the logical outcome of Keynesianism, which is continuous war to dissipate wealth. He says a hierarchical society can only be built on the basis of poverty and drudgery. And you can't restrain the productive process. They tried that between 1900 and 1940 and got a lot of instability. And about 1940, they switched to a deliberate dissipation of wealth, which basically has to be done through war. Although I think if you wrote that today, I think you'd have to give this civilian, I mean,
would you be able to sum up your point a little bit? Because we are running out of time here.
Yeah, well, I think there's a lot of waste in civilian so-called infrastructure spending too. But I would like to hear a little bit about deliberate waste designed to keep people poor and subject to higher political powers.
Okay, if we could respond to values, deliberate waste, and all of these other things within 2 minutes, that would be great.
Okay, sure. Let me take up the issues of compassion and also envy, and hopefully get to waste and the important question about healthcare. On the issue of compassion that the person online raised, as I said, people are compassionate. We do want to help each other, but often we don't have the tools to do it individually. And I think that the history of the reason we have social safety net programs is because private charity and individual compassion wasn't enough to solve these problems that like elderly poverty as an example. There's other problems that we've solved collectively, such as the problem of unemployment. When people were thrown out of work because of economic crashes, they used to, starve, and then we have unemployment insurance and welfare and food stamps to offset that. And so that's an example, I think, where government has been very successful in channeling this important impulse that we have to help other people. On the question of envy, which gets at the question of inequality, I think that the questioner is totally correct in that you do need to have differences in reward so that the people who work the hardest and have the best ideas do get reward, outsized rewards, that inequality is an important motivator. Inequality can bring out the best in us. If we were all given the same amount of rewards, who would have motivation to really be excellent? The problem is how great inequality has gotten and how poisonous envy has become. When you have such outsized rewards, it starts to make people cynical that the system seems more like a lottery. I mean, Facebook is a good example. Mark Zuckerberg is a very smart guy. How smart is employee number 4 who's going to be worth $50 million? Well, I don't know, but he's probably not that much smarter than, employee number 4 of some company down the street that went out of business, right? So we have this kind of lottery system of compensation that has started to become unhinged from merit and talent. And the best examples is these CEOs who, drive companies into the ground and then walk out with a $100 million stock package, like the guy who was running Home Depot while it lost the battle against Lowe's, and its stock went down, and he got $200 million and walked out the door. And we see that all the time. And so this inequality has gotten out of control, and the people at the top have so much money and power, they often feel they can do whatever they want, which makes the rest of us cynical. We feel like, well, the system's being run by a bunch of rich people who aren't necessarily there because of their own merits. So there needs to be a correction there. Inequality is an important motivator. We have too much of it in this current society. I don't really have time to get to the other 2 points raised.
Right.
But
maybe Yaron will bring them up.
Yeah, I'm still going through the CEO who lost the money. It's fascinating to me that nobody complains about Dice K. I don't know if you remember Dice K, but he was the pitcher for the Boston Red Sox, a Japanese guy who signed a deal for $50 million and came in, I think it was 100 with the signing bonus and everything, $100 million. and was a complete disaster. And yet, okay, the Boston Red Sox screwed up. They paid him too much money. That's their problem. If Home Depot paid the guy who worked for Home Depot too much money, their shareholders should be pissed off. I'm not a shareholder. I don't care. But let me address envy, because I think that's an interesting question. So I don't think envy is hardwired into us, but I completely agree with the idea that envy is a driving force in our society. And societies that are driven by envy, both fear of other people envying you and the envy itself, are societies that are destructive and societies that stagnate. And one of the, and this is the bigger point, and I think it addresses also the point about war. I believe the world is guided by ideas, not about hardwiring, whether for compassion or for envy, but by ideas. The ideas of the Enlightenment, the ideas of individualism, the ideas behind liberty and freedom are ideas that liberate us from envy. They are ideas that say that you are what you are. It's your life. It's your responsibility. It's your happiness if you choose to pursue it, and if you succeed in gaining it. Yeah, you might be lucky and get $50 million. I've got lots of friends in Silicon Valley, really, really smart, who've never hit the jackpot in $50 million, but they're still really, really smart, and they're really, really happy because they're working hard, and they've made money and they're doing well, but they never weren't number 4 employee at Facebook. Number 4 employee at companies that didn't do as well. It's that individualistic pursuit of happiness, pursuit of excellence in your own life. It's making your life the best that it can be. Those ideas of the Enlightenment, those ideas of Ayn Rand, those ideas of individualism are what liberate us from envy. And societies that embrace that are societies that have less envy, or where envy is gone, are successful societies and thrive. And when we start collectivizing, when we start thinking in groups, when we think our lives is not that important, but it's relative to other people, when we start looking over the fences into what other people are doing and caring about them more than what we care about ourselves, that's when societies fall apart and break apart and dissipate. And I think that collectivistic view leads to that. And again, you'd have to read a lot more to see how those two are connected. But collectivism leads to envy, in my view. War, and then I'll wrap it up.
Yeah, wrap it
yes,
up.
war. Look, I think the world is driven by ideas. Ideas are what lead us into war, not some elite set out and bent out to destroy and impoverish us. George Bush did not go to Iraq and Afghanistan, whether you agree with the wars or not is irrelevant, in order to impoverish Americans or in order to facilitate the industrial military complex. He did it because he had certain ideas that guided him towards that, and again, I would challenge those ideas, and I would wage war very differently than the way he waged it. But it's ideas. It's not a conspiracy. We have had bad ideas guiding this country for the last 80, 90 years. As a consequence, we fought many, many really, really stupid wars that have impoverished us, that the consequence is impoverishing us. But it's those ideas that have to be challenged, not a conspiracy of guiding us into those ideas that is hell-bent. Politicians are monument builders, but they typically build pyramids. They build beautiful city halls that cost hundreds of millions of dollars. Go look at the San Jose City Hall, which they can't afford anymore. And they build this stuff. Wars are typically done for really, really bad reasons, but because of bad ideological reasons, not because of special interest groups. At least that's my view.
All right. Well, thank you both for a very enlightening discussion. Thank you all for attending. I forgot to mention at the onset of this debate, this is one in a series of debates that are going to be continually televised or available online, and I believe the next debate will be in October. So check your local listings.